Hi, this is Remembering the Past, the show where we talk about people who've died recently who've had a profound effect on our history, our society, or our culture. And tonight the subject will be basketball coaches. And we're going to start out with Jerry Tarkanian, who died recently at the age of 84. Nice Armenian boy from Ohio who moved out to the Central Valley in California and became the coach for, among others, Pasadena City College, Long Beach State, where he had a couple of memorable games against John Wooden at UCLA, Fresno State, and for a brief while the San Antonio Spurs. But of course, Jerry Tarkanian's greatest legacy will be as the coach of the UNLV Runnin' Rebels. He put UNLV on the map. His team at Las Vegas won the 1990 National Championship, came very close to a back-to-back in 1991, was upset by Duke in the semifinals, and he coached some great players including Larry Johnson, Reggie Theus, Greg Anthony, and Stacey Augmon. He emphasized an up-tempo style and great defense, but he could coach any style, and if his players didn't always graduate or meet eligibility requirements, say, people were willing to overlook that because he was a pretty nice guy and his teams won. Besides, he always took on the NCAA, and they weren't exactly the nicest guys in the world either. He had that ubiquitous towel in his mouth on the sidelines to keep his mouth from getting dry, and he never took himself too seriously. So from my standpoint, Jerry Tarkanian and his teams were always a pleasure to watch. Here's an ESPN report on Jerry Tarkanian.
From 1973 to 1992, Tarkanian was the sad-eyed face of UNLV, the familiar image of his sucking a towel during tense games, juxtaposed with highlights of his unrelenting offense and elite talent on the court. Tarkanian coached UNLV to more than 500 wins in 19 seasons, 4 times taking the Rebels to the Final Four. His crowning glory was his 1990 team, still recalled with awe. That Vegas team ran Duke off the floor by 30 points in the national championship game. The next season, Tark's club was just as fierce and just as flamboyantly up-tempo. UNLV was a heavy favorite to repeat. The Reds' obstacle, a rematch with Duke in the national semifinals.
That game still hurts me. I don't even like to watch it anymore.
It wasn't just losing a basketball game. It was losing an opportunity for immortality.
The flip side of Tarkanian's career was captured in his nickname, Tark the Shark. He battled the NCAA nearly constantly through his career. Tarkanian took an 11-year legal fight over a proposed NCAA suspension all the way to the Supreme Court of the United States. In 1988, the High Court ruled that while the NCAA may discipline member schools, it must provide due process, which Tarkanian had been denied.
Tark's one of the great renegades in basketball history. I spent as much time fighting with the NCAA, it seemed, as coaching basketball. He wore the black hat and seemed to enjoy it a great deal.
Shortly after the Final Four loss to Duke, Tark's career in Vegas essentially ended with the publication of his photograph, 3 of his players in a hot tub with a convicted basketball game fixer. Tarkanian was given one final season, and then he was leaving Las Vegas. Tark tried the NBA, but 2 months as head coach of the San Antonio Spurs ended poorly in 1992. His alma mater, Fresno State, brought Tarkanian home in 1995 for the final 7 years of his career. That stint, too, resulted in NCAA probation, but he did reach 700 victories. The man who coached the Rebels had controversy follow him like a Vegas spotlight. Despite 729 collegiate wins, Jerry Tarkanian had to wait 11 years after coaching his last game for enshrinement in the Basketball Hall of Fame. Tark, the Shark, remembered for his brilliance recruiting and coaching some of the college game's most talented teams.
There's so many aspects to coaching, getting a group of people to play together and be unselfish and care about each other. I think it takes a unique person.
Tark the Shark, a great coach. We're going to move on to another great coach, Dean Smith, who died recently at the age of 83. He's our feature tonight, and he coached on the other side of the country at North Carolina for 36 years. He helped integrate college basketball in the South and went on to become one of the great coaching innovators and educators in basketball history. Dean Smith has quite a basketball pedigree. He played at Kansas, where he was coached by Fog Allen, who in turn was coached by James Naismith, who invented basketball. So you're talking about basically the royal lineage of basketball in the United States. He won 2 national championships and was in 11 Final Fours and coached some of the top players in basketball history, including Michael Jordan, James Worthy, Sam Perkins, Billy Cunningham, and Larry Brown. Here's ESPN on Dean Smith.
Carolina Blue became synonymous with basketball excellence thanks to a man from Kansas, Dean Smith. Smith's Hall of Fame numbers are indeed impressive. 36 seasons, 2 national titles, 11 Final Fours, and 13 ACC championships. Those numbers are only a part of the Dean Smith story. First and foremost, he was a man of principle, even in those early years in Chapel Hill when winning didn't come as often as the Tar Heel faithful would have liked.
He was a stickler for detail. Priorities were, number one, school, conducting yourself correctly, would not tolerate anything but that. And then it was basketball.
Dean Smith had a social conscience, evidenced by his signing of Charlie Scott in the late 60s. Scott was the first African-American basketball player at a major Southern university. To Scott, he was just another member of the Carolina family.
Here's Delaney back to Scott. Charlie's at the circle, up for the shot, and it's good! And the ball game is over. North Carolina has won 87-85. Charlie Scott pumps it in there for the victory.
I think sometimes people really get upset when they get around Carolina guys because they say that they feel like that we sugarcoat it or that we, that overdo it. But when you have a man that for 36 years has been in touch with every player that has ever played for him and writes to every player that ever played for him and talks to them and is involved in anything in life that they are involved in to be there to help them, how can you not feel that umbilical cord and how can you not feel gratified?
In the 70s, Dean Smith's Tar Heels welcomed point guard Phil Ford to the program. The first freshman to ever start under the legendary coach, Ford ran Smith's innovative four corners offense to perfection. Ford came to Chapel Hill because of Smith's honesty as a recruiter.
The first time Coach Smith talked to me, we didn't talk basketball. I guess for 45 minutes to an hour in our first conversation, we talked about being a good citizen, race relations, just so many things around the world that was going on at that time. And my mama kind of liked that. We talked about the importance of an education.
Whether it was a superstar player or little-used reserve, Smith cared that all his players understood what it meant to wear a North Carolina uniform.
I kept telling the press, each of those, anybody that ever played here, they helped recruit the next guys, so all of them were involved. And then we have been lucky, the type of young man, a student athlete at the University of North Carolina, and 96% of them got their degree, and over 40% got their graduate or professional degrees.
Legend certainly describes Dean Smith. He would much prefer to be called a teacher. His players would all agree that both titles fit.
Dean Smith was derided for a while for not being able to win the big game. It was over 20 years before he won the national championship, and it was broken in 1982 in the famous game where Michael Jordan hit a shot in the last 10 seconds to beat Georgetown with Patrick Ewing and Sleepy Floyd by 1 point. Here's that story. I remember that day I was in a bar with one of my best friends and we were talking about this freshman Michael Jordan. And then he goes and knocks down that shot. We had no idea what was coming.
In the last minute of the last college basketball game of 1982, with Georgetown leading North Carolina 62-61, a moment as symbolic as it was historic suddenly unfolded at courtside. Dean Smith called a timeout, leaving everyone to wonder which of his two stars, James Worthy or Sam Perkins, would be anointed to take the last shot. Kneeling in the huddle, Smith told them, "I'd rather be in our shoes than theirs. We are going to determine who wins this game." For a guy who'd been to 6 Final Fours and never won the big one, who'd been hung in effigy and nearly fired, Smith now looked eerily calm, almost serene. He knew that everybody in the gym was expecting the ball to go to either Worthy or Perkins, so he figured they'd be covered, and this would leave his 19-year-old freshman, a skinny kid named Michael Jordan, free to take the first good shot. Earlier that year, Smith had scolded his young gunner, "Michael, if you can't pass, you can't play." By year's end, Jordan had learned the Carolina way, the patience, discipline, and teamwork that Smith had been preaching all his life. Now, as the huddle split, a gambling Smith loaded everything on the kid, telling him, "Knock it in, Michael." 15 seconds later, there was Jordan rising off the floor, and there was serene Dean, looking quietly on as Jordan's shot went in, swishing shut the window on Smith's frustrated past, even as it opened yet another on the game's Jordanian future. If Smith was the world's best teacher of basketball, as John Wooden once said, Michael was his finest student, and their bond was emblematic of the kind that Smith forged with all his players, one so tight it suggested family. "Coach taught me the game," Jordan said. He's like a second father to me.
Another thing you want to remember is that Dean Smith took over North Carolina right around the time of the Greensboro, North Carolina sit-ins, which we've talked about in another podcast. A couple years later, he recruited Charlie Scott, the first black player at North Carolina or in the ACC, a hell of a player. Here's a little of that story.
As I got to know Dean through the years, I was so impressed with the fact that he saw teaching and instructing as being the really most important aspects of what he was doing. He was not only just trying to develop athletic skills among his athletes, but he was preparing them for life.
When Dean Smith arrived at UNC in the early 1960s, he chose to worship at the only integrated church in Chapel Hill. He worked with church leaders to usher black students into restaurants where once only whites were served. To some, the efforts of an assistant basketball coach seemed bold and radical, but to others, simply the right thing to do.
North Carolina at that time was not the most progressive state in the nation. There was a big sign in North Carolina down near Smithfield that said, "This is Klan."
Dean was here in those tumultuous years of the 60s, when Chapel Hill was having great difficulty bringing black and white schools together at all deliberate speed.
When Coach Smith took over the head job, he marshaled effort to bring the first black scholarship athlete to Chapel Hill.
Here's the most valuable player in the tournament, Charlie Scott.
The courage that he demonstrated when he decided to bring Charlie Scott on board was, I think, something to be extremely admired by all of us.
Coach Smith had a way of making you feel very comfortable around him. He had a way of making it feel very personable about his relationship with you.
Well, you know, people would always talk about, they say, well, Coach Smith had so many All-Americans. Well, we weren't All-American when we went there.
Everyone wants to know what Coach Smith did with the Michael Jordans and the James Worthys and the Charlie Scotts. Coach Smith's biggest contribution to all of us was not those guys who went into the pros. It was to the 300 other guys who didn't go into the pros.
Coach Smith cared as much about the walk-ons as he did the superstars. And because he cared so much about them, I think that made them care so much about each other.
Coach Smith's niche was always to get you to think. I mean, to get you to open up your mind, to look beyond what was right in front of you.
People would say, it takes courage to do this. And he says, never takes courage to do what's right. If you know what's right, you try to do what's right.
Charlie Scott very emotional about Dean Smith, and Kenny Smith was narrating that he was another one of his players. And here's Antoine Jameson, another one of his great players, talking about Dean Smith.
We got recruited from just about anybody. And, coaches promise you come here, you'll start. You come here, we'll try to make it, to the NBA. Coach Smith said, I don't know if you'll start. I don't know if you'll make it to the NBA. Two things I promise you. One, you're going to get an education. You come here, you're a student athlete first. And the second thing, you're going to become a better man than what you were before you came through this program. He told my mom and dad that it was, this is it. So, as parents, you understand the importance of that as well. But he didn't care about just the athlete. It was about you as a human being, you as a man, really giving you the tools to be able to succeed after college. And that was one of the selling points, or not selling points, but pretty much who he was, and he was true to that. They pretty much sold my parents after that. He never allowed us to have our heads down. He was always there, positive. He let you know when you need to improve or you didn't show effort, but he always believed in us as a team.
Finally, here's Dean Smith himself talking about his philosophy.
Well, I think it's true, whatever you do, that you're there to serve. We brag about the guy that makes the unselfish play. As a coach, you're in charge, and I take that seriously. So your last game, it's either a loss or you're champions. But then off the court, we try to be a servant and help them reach their goals.
It's Dean Smith, a legend in college coaching. I'm going to close on that note. I want to thank my producer and IT genius, Sid Tepps. And to honor Dean Smith, I'm going to close tonight with a little bit of the University of North Carolina fight song, I'm a Tar Heel Born.